Hi, welcome everybody to the IMPAKT Festival and our talk on Whole Earth Revision. In a more ideal situation, we could have met in real life, but due to the corona crisis, we're meeting each other online. And it might feel a bit off, but at the same time, I think we can say that we're blessed that we do have this opportunity. My name is Hasna Maroudi. I'm a journalist. I'm the co-founder of the intersectional feminist platform Lilith Mag, and today's topic I hold very close to my heart. Enough about me. Back in the 60s, the American counterculture magazine Whole Earth Catalog presented a self-sustaining ecological lifestyle for the future, employing both archaic resources and the latest technologies. 50 years later, we wonder, is it possible to develop sustainable, environmentally friendly technologies for everyone? And can we provide these solutions on a global scale? To do so, we need an inclusive, a holistic approach to turn the tide. In concrete terms, this means that we must take all inhabitants of the earth into account, including those who are already affected by the consequences of climate change. From their research and projects, the speakers in this panel argue for a broader approach to technology, to climate justice, and the embracing of indigenous knowledge. In the first part of today's talk, our panelists will introduce their work through a presentation, and in the second part, we'll dive more into the specifics. If you have a question, feel free to drop the question into the Zoom chat box or via the Ask Questions button on the website or the web portal. And I'll try to either include your questions and ask them on your behalf, or I'll try to bring you in so you can take part in the discussion or the talk. So our panelists today are landscape designer and educator Julia Watson. Also with us today is Bram Büscher, professor and chair of the sociology of listen to Chihiro Geuzebroek. Chihiro is a decolonial climate justice public speaker, a spoken word artist, and filmmaker. She produced and directed the activist coming-of-age future documentary Radical Friends, and she's been active in grassroots activism for over a decade. There's so much more I could say about Chihiro, but let's listen to her.
Hello, let me unmute myself. Hello, so lovely that you're tuning in. I'm very happy to speak with you, both the other panelists and the listeners today. And I'll be briefly touching on, if we're thinking or rethinking about technology, we have to see what is it made to do? What is it fit for purpose? And when we think about purpose, we have to think about how we're going to move from harm to health. So here I want to talk as an activist and as an artist, that the first thing our technology needs to do is not do something, but stop doing something. So moving from harm to health, we have to stop our harmful habits. And here we see a picture from an exposition that I'm opening today. It's about a century of decolonial resistance against colonial Dutch shell, which has brought us this, climate breakdown, ecological breakdown through employment of technology in a harmful way. So our first task is to stop corporations of mass destruction instead of just adding on something. And speaking from the Dutch perspective, it's really important to look at a company like Shell. So let me click through to the slide, next slide. And does it respond? I'm clicking, but it's not reacting. Well, technology is always a challenge. So here we're going back to a grounded perspective. And for this expo, I really wanted to open with an installation of Earth as a crime scene. And so we got 1,500 kilo of Earth, that's a square meter, delivered to build a web and really see what it is that we're addressing. Because oftentimes we're only scratching the surface and looking at the symptom of climate change. But again, I think the symptom of climate change is often visualized in this graph of rising ppm, and ppm stands for parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But if we look at the atmosphere, it's just the last point where harm shows up, the last point of where colonization shows up. Before that, we see that industries and industrial technology has ravaged the land, people, and places. And so here, this is also speaking to an exposition that is happening today. We've built another installation of the long timeline, and we see that we have to go all the way back to the 19th century, where already the climate science, people like Arrhenius were saying, hey, green industrial revolution is increasing greenhouse gases and leading to climate change and climate breakdown. We already see that this is exactly the time when Shell started operating in the Netherlands. So our task is to restore relationship with Earth and each other. And my call to frame this conversation that we're having today is that we really need to look not just at the symptom of ecological breakdown, but look at what produced it. And so I think in this slide, we can really see that the CO2 is the end result, and what has come before is a culture of genocide and ecocide. And so there's never been a destruction of nature without a destruction of people. And we can look at the people that came before. For instance, Shell started exploiting the oil in Indonesia end of the 19th century. And in Indonesia, oil had already been discovered since the 17th century. So it had been in use for a while, but it hadn't been used for industrial purposes. It had been used to as a medicine, as a way for tarring boats. It had been used for balance, and I think that's the central point, that we need to move from a whole model of operating of profit and property to a whole model of operating, working for balance and reciprocity. And if we work from balance and reciprocity, the technology that we then design has to fit that purpose. Thank you for helping me with the slides. So here we come to my film. It's also a tool for sparking a vision of that world of reciprocity, a world of radical friendship. So radical comes from the root, coming from the root, that's what it means. So if we talk about radical friendship, it means that we nurture relationships, and our instruments or our culture also has to be made in aligned with that, in that sphere. So this comes with both resistance and reparation. So often we find that resistance or protest is cast aside as, oh, that's just negative, that's just saying no to something. But in order to burst something, you have to distinguish between what is harmful and what is helpful. And so we both need resistance and we need reparations. And I'm really looking forward to discussing the work of Julia Watson in this regard, because it has been a huge inspiration for me to talk about that alignment, what that looks like in Indigenous ways. Again, moving to the next slide. So while I'm speaking or incorporating these visions in the art, I also want to do a shout out to other movement that has already put forward so much vision for reparations and resistance and Indigenous governance. So my inspiration has come from Bolivia and the discourse of rights for Mother Earth. That's definitely a model of governance of reciprocity, where you don't just have to establish in court that an industry is doing wrong to a river if it is impacting humans, but the river itself has rights to is its own entity and deserves health. So if a corporation harms a river or harms an ecosystem, it could have legal standing in court. Another example in terms of reparations and justice comes from the campaign Stop the Mangamizi. I would also really advise people to look into that, because I think one of the misinterpretations of today is that innovation will save us, when oftentimes medicine has been around, all around us, but we have to stop ignoring it and work with it. So coming to a close, and the final slide is really an appeal in this conversation as well, that our whole Earth revision is not about saving the future, but it's about healing from a colonial past and a colonial presence, because the climate crisis is a colonial crisis that needs decolonial solutions. And it's really a humbling moment for us in the climate movement to say that we've never been the first. There's always been people before us that have been defending the Earth. And here you see a picture on the right where the one on the right is from this year in 2020 with the Shell Must Fall campaign right in front of the HQ of Shell in The Hague. And next to it, you see 1996, a protest in front of the Shell HQ of our elders in resistance. So I think that's the bell, and also a good time for me to stop and hand it over to the next speaker. And I look forward so much to our panel discussion to interact.
Thank you so much, Chihiro. It was really lovely to hear you speak on this topic, and later on we'll hear more from you in the panel talk. Next up is Bram Büscher. As I said, Bram Büscher is professor and chair of the Sociology of Development and Change Group at Wageningen University. He also holds visiting positions at the University of Johannesburg and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He has published widely on the relations between nature, development, and politics. And together with Robert Fletcher, he wrote The Conservation Revolution, Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene, which was published by Verso in 2020. The floor is yours, Bram.
Thank you so much, Hasna, and thank you everybody for joining. Again, as Chihiro said, it's a shame we can't meet, in person and have, an in-person debate due to the circumstances. But we'll have to make it do like this. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I want to present some ideas from the recent book that Hasna just mentioned, where we try to think through how the conservation sector can help towards a whole Earth revision, right? So when you think about the whole Earth revision and the way in which we need the to holistically think about transformational change across the entire planet, many people actually think that the conservation sector is already fully embraced into this vision and is sort of an innate force for good when it comes to this. But actual reality is quite a bit different. And I want to illustrate that by basically showing a couple of graphs that relate to discussions on the Anthropocene. And now my internet clicker is also not working here, so I hope that the organizers can move to the next one. You don't have to actually read all the science here, because it's too small in any event. But the idea here is that you see a lot of hockey stick graphs that show on all kinds of socioeconomic and Earth system indicators how we've been using the planet, how we are engaged with the rest of nature, and what kind of impact that has on the planet. And if you look at this these hockey stick graphs, you see that the impact is absolutely ginormous and clearly unsustainable. Now, conservation is supposed to be a sector that sort of works against that, or to mediate that in order to save biodiversity. So if you go to the next slide, which incidentally I don't see myself anymore. Oh yeah, there we go. You see the same hockey stick graph in terms of protected areas. And protected areas have always been the mainstay and the real sort of core of what conservation is all about. I mean, it's certainly not the only thing, but very, very central historically to conservation. And basically it's about setting nature apart from humans, or at least non-human nature apart from humans. And then you see in this particular graph how the rise of conservation through protected areas happens at exactly the same time as all these other graphs that show the problem. So in a certain way, and I think this has been, at least for me, an important sort of realization, right? That the rise of conservation has gone hand in hand with the rise of global unsustainability, the sixth extinction crisis, climate change, etc. And hence, in some way or another, they're kind of part of the same problem. And mainstream conservation will not be able to get us out of this. Now we go to the next slide. I want to give or show a couple of reasons why this is the case. So in the book we analyze the great conservation debate, and I won't go into detail, but just if you go to the next point, show that there are a couple of main problems with contemporary sort of mainstream conservation and the alternatives. So next. Yes, thank you. Namely, three main issues. And this is very blunt, but we can go into this in a bit more detail perhaps in the discussion. First, contemporary dominant conservation perspectives do not distance themselves from a completely unsustainable global capitalism. Second, they continue to separate nature and people, as I showed, especially through protected areas. And there's a particular stream of conservation now that actually promotes what they call half Earth, where half of the entire planet needs to go into protected areas. And with colleagues from all over the world, we've actually put what we call the whole Earth perspective opposed to that. And thirdly, they naively believe that more modern technology in and of itself can save nature. Now, I'm looking forward to Julia's presentation on different ideas about technology. But here I'm talking, of course, about social media and sort of modern, putting a chip on every animal alive and seeing where they go, rather than really connecting with nature on a very different way, in a way that I think Chihiro also mentioned. Ergo, something different and revolutionary is needed. And if we go to the next slide, I believe that this is, one what's possible, at least this is our sort of contribution, together with a whole group of people from literally around the world, including where I do a lot of my own work, South Africa, come to this idea of convivial conservation. Convivial means living together, convivere, and is basically an intertwined strategy beyond growth and beyond the nature-people dichotomy. What you see with the current debates is that some try to do the one without the other, and we think that you need both. You need to go beyond growth and beyond the nature-people dichotomy, and hence in that way allow the conservation sector to build, and next slide, next point, to become a stream in a much wider wave of movements that want system redesign, that want a whole Earth revision. And here is just some of them. And next click. I believe that this particular crisis that we're in shows, again, why this is needed. Next. So there's a lot to be said about convivial conservation, and we do so in our book, but I won't go into any detail here. I want to say two things. First, that we must always combine long-term aspirations with short-term actions and deal with power in the meantime. So we have several. Next slide, please. Next click. This one, yes. Where we combine long-term propositions with indeed short-term political actions, and the long-term position basically means that conservation is envisioned very differently. It moves away from protected areas to what we call promoted areas, where human and non-human natures do not need saving, but are actually celebrated. And I think, again, this responds nicely to what Chihiro says, that we shouldn't destroy it in the first place, where we visit nature through engagement rather than touristic voyeurism, where the focus is on the everyday and decommodified natures and technologies, and all of which supports common democratic engagement. Now, this is a long-term vision that we have for conservation. And then we move to the next slide. We have a couple of concrete actions to shift the political terrain. And if you put them on the slide, everybody can sort of see. Just put all 5 of them on please, because I can't go into any detail. Just want to, sort of show that there are very concrete things that we can do right now in order to shift, the political terrain in the ways that conservation can help with a whole Earth revision. It starts with decolonizing conservation, right? Absolutely central. But you can also think about other things, like, for example, conservation basic income mechanism, certainly for conservation organizations to rethink corporations, relations with corporations, but also more practically on the ground to really rethink and redesign landscapes and the financial and governance structures around those. And again, I won't say anything about that because I think Julia will be able to say much more about this. So next slide. Basically concluding, what we want to say is that conservation should help to push for a post-capitalist transformation. Now, what does this entail? It means first, the changes at the systemic level, so the micro, macro need to be connected, whereby you tackle biodiversity, social and political economic crisis at the same time. Now, how to do that? We think key levers for change are dealing with power, time, and actors. Time, long and short term. Actors, look at the differentiated impact of different actors within conservation. So bring people, indigenous peoples and communities into this at the front and center, but not responsibilize them in such a way that they're responsible for biodiversity to court, but also bring people from outside into this who have a lot of indirect impact on biodiversity in the world. And of course, deal with power, right? It's a political struggle. In order to do that, we need to reclaim revolution, right? To not let change overcome us like the current corona crisis, but actually to plan and push for it deliberately. And we think that conservation is a very good base to actually do so. And with that, I would like to end, because I think also my 10 minutes are more or less up, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bram, for your enlightening talk. So next up will be Julia Watson. As I said, Watson is a landscape designer and educator. She's a leading expert on indigenous technologies, and her best-selling book with Taschen is Low Tech, Designed by Radical Indigenism, and it has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Monocle, Architectural Digest, and much, much more. I could also go on and on summing up her resume, but instead let's hear from Julia Watson herself. The floor is yours.
Hi,
yes,
thank you so much. I'm so excited to be on this panel and to have just listened to Chihiro and Bram. They're just incredible conversations to begin, and I look forward to continuing them. But first, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm here today and I'm speaking to you from the traditional land of the first people of Brooklyn, New York, the Lenape people past and present, and honor with gratitude the land and the Lenape people. So I'm going to talk to you today about Designed by Radical Indigenism. And so, in a story that's become all too familiar all around the globe, earlier this year, we saw large parts of my home country, Australia, that were alight with the worst wildfires that Australia had ever seen. And these wildfires were caused by a lot of things: seasonal drought, delayed rains, underfunded prevention, but really century-old bans on cultural burning practices by settler states. But in the midst of this catastrophe, we learned something really interesting, and that was that the lands of the ancestral lands that still practiced cultural burning, or what we call in Australia fire stick farming, they were fine as these fires just raged around them. And so this is an image. This is Victor Stephenson, and he's an Indigenous writer, he's a filmmaker, he's a consultant, and he's teaching right now in this image Aboriginal fire acknowledgement as in an Indigenous fire workshop. And this image is courtesy of the Fire Stick Alliances. If you've not looked up this community, this group, you should definitely look up. They're doing incredible work in Australia, sharing knowledge. And so Indigenous pyrotechnology having evolved over millennia, this actually cut down the impact of the fires on the landscape by half. Here you can see an image of the burning of gum tree country, and this ecosystem, it's done at the right time to promote this slow burning. And so the trees in the landscape, they survive because of this slow, cool burning that's guided by traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and that's passed down. And so recently we've also seen a lot of wildfires happening, and we saw them raging across the American West. We've seen them in the Arctic, in Siberia, we've seen them in Brazil, in Bolivia, we've seen them across the Amazon, and we've seen it with really increasing ferocity. And we understand that the threat of wildfires, this is a global phenomenon. This has been happening. This is part of our natural ecosystem. This is a phenomenon that occurs. But it's also an indicator of climate change. And we know that it's a man-made disaster, not only because it's climate change, because we know we have ancient technology that's also contemporary technology that we know can prevent these wildfires. So what if, like pyrotechnology, some of our most sustainable innovations were actually rooted in culture and country that had figured these technologies and innovations out a millennia ago? And so in my profession, there was a really important architect, Cedric Price, and in 1966, he asked a really important question. And he said, if technology is the answer, what was the question? And this really provoked my field of design to question the whole impact of technology on culture, on cities, on societies, and on architecture. And I really think that today we're kind of stuck asking a similar question, but also another question that is very similar, and that is, if sustainability is the answer, then what was the question? Because we can keep on going up higher, we can keep on going out wider, and we can keep on going deeper to extract. But to what end is sustainability really going to change any of the conditions or any of the futures which seem to be appearing if we don't systemically change the conditions by which we're interacting with the earth right now? And if we're really going to get serious about mitigating climate change, then we need to consider that the most effective way is not by replicating high-tech technologies that are just small in number and they're costly, and they're really made primarily for wealthy nations. And that the most effective way to mitigate climate change is to recognize that there are solutions that are embedded in culture and in country, and they're evolved through traditional ecological knowledge of the people and their environments, and that will be the most effective way to form resilience at scale. And so this is an image of a system called the Qanat, and it's an underground aqueduct, and it's found in the Middle East. And one of the things that it does is it passively cools buildings while moving water underground through an aquifer that transfers water in a really arid desert environment across very vast scales. And here is the wind tower. It's called a yakachal, and it actually creates this evaporative cooling that works. And this building stores ice in the summer that's created in the winter as it catches wind through these wind towers, but also through the transfer of water underneath. And it creates these conditions to enable this. So now here's an image that shows you the actual Qanat. You can see it sort of cut into the earth, and it's this cross-sectional tunnel that's dug through the earth. It begins with the aquifer, and it's a technology that's about 3,000 years old. And they're meticulously designed underground tunnels and channels, and they were first constructed by the Persians. This technology has moved all across the Middle East into Europe and actually through China, and it's now seen across many, many different countries, but it began here. And it sources, it directs, and it transports water through the earth to different cities. And they have traditionally been hand dug. They can be several kilometers long, and they're composed of these vertical shafts that are sunk at about 20 to 30 meters. And when you see, say, an image like this, you can see these vertical shafts parked across the landscape that then lead to an actual city. And it was a really important technology because all about water conservation. And that was a really high priority for the Persians. And this innovation releases water back into the aquifer at its end rather than being a continuous process of extraction. And it also serves as this really amazing model for how to cool public spaces and passive cooling technologies. So another example that's actually really close by to the origin of the Qanat is an islanding in this housing system that's made from a single species of reed called, the technology is called the Altala and the Marif houses, and they're made by the people of the southern wetlands of Iraq, who are the Madan people. And this type of housing has actually been depicted by Sumerian Uruk imagery, so it's dated about 6,500 years old. And this kasab breed, it's actually integral to every single aspect of life. It is food for humans to make flour. It's food fodder for water buffalo, but it's also this biodegradable building technology. And it's really incredibly versatile. These houses are constructed in as little as 3 days. And the reason it's so versatile is it can be bundled into these really large columns that are counterweighted and sunk into the islands. It can be bundled into rafters. It's woven into walls and floors and roofing systems. And then it's finally twisted into this rope that's binding the buildings without any nails. And so this is an image of the Madan village. It's a pretty old image. There's not a lot of images coming out of this particular area of the country, but these villages are still constructed as they have been for generations. And these islands, they stay afloat for about 25 years. And the last example that I wanted to show was this example for where, in other parts of the world, we see that rivers are left contaminated with sewage, but there's an Indian city, it's a city of 15 million people that it actually uses its floodplains to treat half its wastewater. And it does this through this combination of sunshine and sewage and a symbiosis, which is a really important word, between algae and bacteria, and it breaks wastewater down. And then these fish ponds, which are part of this really large-scale system, actually continue cleaning the water. And this whole sewage water processing treatment takes about 30 days. And it sits on the edges of the city of Calcutta, and it's flanked by this smoking escarpment of the city's trash, and it's ribboned by highways. It's on the forefront of the development. It's actually being encroached upon by development. And it's this technology that's composed of 300 fish ponds that clean the city's water while producing its food, and it's about 100 years old. And so this innovation is not just a model for chemical and coal power-free purification. It also provides 100,000 jobs, and it's the only way to clean the water that's coming from the city, the core of Calcutta City, to the Bay of Bengal. And these technologies that improve climate mitigation solutions, they just don't need to be passive and pristine landscapes. That can be active, they can be adaptive, they can be productive, and they can be complex coexistence of many human and non-human species that use biodiversity as a building block. And so low tech, it's a combination of two words, local and TEK, and it's also a provocation to poke fun at the way we look at these technologies and to really say that, we ignorantly say these technologies are low tech, LOWTECH, and they're primitive or they're unsophisticated, but they're actually incredibly sophisticated technologies, and they embody all of today's sustainability principles. They embody low energy, low impact, low cost, and they form closed loop systems. TEK, this is the traditional ecological knowledge, and it stands for traditional ecological knowledge, and it's the cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And finally, this term, radical indigenism. This is a term by Princeton PhD and Boston College professor Eva Marie Garut, who's also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and she argues for a rebuilding of knowledge through explorations of indigenous philosophies that are capable of generating new knowledge and new dialogues for indigenous communities. So we are seemingly drowning in this age of information while starving for wisdom. And just to conclude, we can either continue this narrow view of technology, or that distances us from nature, as Bram was talking about, or we can acknowledge that the current globally dominant model of progress is just one way, and it is not the only way for humans to live and to design in response to climate crisis. And low tech is an idea for a movement that sees creativity in crisis, and it rebuilds sustainable climate resilient infrastructures that are inspired by local technology and vernacular design. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Julia. What great examples! I've just been blown away. Also, because I'm originally from Morocco, and when I go back to Morocco, there's always these things that I see that are so well. These things that we take from a culture, like the way the houses are built, and it's also natural that it's even when it's 40 degrees Celsius outside, it's very cooled on the inside. We don't need air conditioning, and it always blows me away that here in the West or whatever, we somehow look at the world through this blurred way. I think it's an amazing way to show us all these examples, to just show what there already is. So now we're going to talk to all the panelists together. Yeah, hi everybody. When we look at all these examples that Julia just gave and the things you've spoken about, I'm just wondering, if there's already all this indigenous knowledge, why aren't we using it? Why is the world not using it? Chihiro, maybe you can reflect on that.
Sure, yeah. Well, I can sum it up in one word, and that is epistemicide. And so what that means, like, epistemology is a system of knowledge, and side, like genocide or ecocide, is this structural destruction of something. So so indigenous people, and when I say indigenous people, that really speaks to people who have been colonized, because there are many thousands of different indigenous people all across the world and have different cultures and governance. But one thing that they don't think the land is theirs, but that they belong to the land. And so what it also indigenous plants or indigenous animals, what it speaks to indigeneity is to the land, listening to nature. And so the knowledge and the wisdom that comes from these cultures is based on listening to the country, to the place, to the land. Destroys that knowledge, literally through burning libraries or forbidding to speak your own language or forbidding even dances. We see that that knowledge has crumbled, but it's not lost. It's still there, and we can revitalize it, just like other things that have been damaged under colonization.
I was just going to reinforce, also banned. I know in Australia, practices of cultural burning were completely banned because it was in competition with colonial agriculture. So there's an erasure, an intentional erasure. But you find that, in India, you can see the stepwell systems were erased by colonial water systems. And so there's very intentional practices that have overwritten the types of nature-based technologies that we're talking about. And I also think we're at a time where, there has to be, it's not just a knowledge to be taken or used. There has to be a whole new set of relations, something that's led by indigenous communities who actually hold knowledge, and that's their knowledge. And so these are examples, and a lot of these examples are actually some are, Persian systems. There are use, and sometimes they're actually not seen because the governments trust the West to bring technology. So it's a really complicated set of circumstances in answer to the question as well.
And its own system, because well, all these areas aren't the same. But is it somehow still possible to develop a sustainable and environmental friendly technology that will serve the entire world?
System, not needs its own system. And I think more that there's like a recognition that the system exists, and that the approach would be that, I mean, I think Bram could speak to this, and I would love to hear him talk about, like, you know, the IPCC report and all the, you know, billions of dollars that's going towards conservation and putting companies, when those dollars could be given to Indigenous communities to expand and scale and really work with the technologies. There's different support mechanisms and ways that we can globally approach climate change, not under going to be the solution, because that's where we're going wrong with, you know, Western and high technology. There are different, these decentralized technologies is really the way forward.
Bram, you said that mainstream conservation will not get us out of this, and you already touched this.
Well, first of all, I think I'm not necessarily the one to say that. I mean, we want to add our ideas to a lot of ideas that are already out there. One of the things that we came across, and that I have always known, but that is one of those erasures that I think what Chihiro and Julia have been talking about, is that you think that there are no alternatives. And I've always known you actually realize there's so many, it's actually an embarrassment. I mean, there's so much out there, you can't really do that justice. So we got a little bit overwhelmed with that in our book, and just figured of us can be a stream in that wider movement in one way. I mean, and it doesn't all flow immediately in the same direction. You know, there are frictions in between those, that's fine. But, you know, there is a kind of direction in all of that. And so more about is this idea of a conservation basic income, which is absolutely not meant to bribe or incentivize local people in one way or another, but really as a redistribution mechanism to enable to be political actors vis-a-vis large conservation organizations or other outside interventions that want to tell them how to manage the nature and biodiversity around them, right? And I think those are the kind of things we generally feel we need to promote much more, and that are already sort of out there and sort of can come. And indeed, if we can redirect funds, I think as Julia mentioned, from, you know, going to the big conservation organizations to local people and other organizations themselves, and enable this kind of grassroots, you know, activity.
Yeah. Chihiro, would you like to add on that?
Yeah, I was going through. One thing that I was thinking about was actually the question that Julia raised on technology being the answer. What is the question? And I think one question that is very, quote, easier, or how can we externalize our problems? And I think with that question of how can we externalize our problems and some robot or some technology will take care of it, we're not going to solve any to nature, that we're part of nature. Nature has no beginning, it has no end. So it's about not externalizing our problems. And then also from that, if we look at technology, see that technology is built with resources, and our whole idea of resources have been so messed up, because resources originally, it's a cycle. And what capitalism has done to it is has made nature a resource that is just a raw material for money making. And so it's very linear. and it's very productional and developmental. Like, actually not how can we externalize the problem, technology, but how can we, well, actually, I would love to ask the other panel members, like, what would be the right question to ask, where conversation.
Well, I was going to respond to one of the questions you asked initially, which was what was technology made to do? And I think that's such an important question, because when you look at nature-based technology as opposed to, high-tech systems or green technology systems, nature-based technology is born of scarcity and understanding of limited resources and environmental constraints. And then we get these other technologies which are funded by insurmountable amounts of money and built with unlimited resources. And so it's coming from very different, like, what does technology do? Like, how does it systemically evolve, and how do we change the conditions upon which it systemically evolves?
Yeah. And when we put those green technologies next to indigenous knowledge, can you differences are?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned that, we're talking about low cost and low impact and low embodied energy. But then, for example, if you see the system from Calcutta, which was a sewage aquaculture, free, it's coal power free, it's not through industrial processes, it's not sunlit, but it's also like, the sun panels that take incredible amounts of energy to actually make. It's a relationship energy that ignites the system, and it uses the natural flows of water and the natural cycles on monsoon and the natural changes in pH and everything in the water, those conditions, and it understands that having water to the state from polluted to cleaner, and then it can be used for multiple different purposes. And not only that, it is flood mitigating, it's carbon sequestering, it provides biodiversity, it provides food. Of a technology where if you have a sewage treatment plant, it has a single use, it's universal, it's monofunctional, and it doesn't have the same sort of systemic relationship with the environment that these other systems have.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm also looking for like similarity, something, maybe there are similarities, like things that are taken from the indigenous knowledge and used.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of a workshop I did this summer about medicinal plants, and I was thinking of the in our culture, like those nasty things, and they have so much ability to help with so many different functions. And somewhere, again, like Bram said earlier, like somewhere along, like I was saying earlier, the medicine is all around us, but really human supremacy and white supremacy have really gotten in the way for us to actually be eco-literate. And I think, yeah, just in to that knowledge that has been oppressed, suppressed, erased, and reconnect. And I think we all have reconnecting to do. So yeah, I'm just nodding and also taking notes and also learning.
I'm going to go to a few questions from or the nature dichotomy that is greatly influenced by the fast-paced technological growth that we are all witnessing today. Is there a way we can use technology to not merely tackle the climate crisis, but also profit off? Bram.
Wow, yeah, good question, a big question. I think, I mean, one way to sort of tackle that question is, and maybe also responding to what was said just now, is that there's no position of purity here. And I think this is something that may be interesting in this debate. There's a lot that we need to do in terms of restoring, and I think I fully agree with that. But this also chimes with what has happened afterwards, and contemporary technologies and other forms of ways of being right now that will and also need, and that with colleagues in Southern Africa we're also always talking about a lot. Right? If you take the South African example, a lot of people there connect to nature in many ways, but some of these are very, very problematic to nature than to their non-white neighbors, for example. And this has long been an issue in South Africa and in Southern Africa. And so, connecting with those kind of ideas about nature is not. So in one way, we need to mix those kind of ideas with others and with indigenous understandings in order to find yet new ways, right? So restoring something, and this is maybe a question to both Chihiro and Julia, does not mean that in one way or another you're going back to something, but it's a road that we have to walk together that will inevitably also see a lot of resistance, right, from power against this, very directly. We see this time and time again. And so, I mean, I don't know whether I answered the question at all. Process where we will falter, but we need to have a bigger vision together with more local and micro technologies and bring them together to find at least the right direction, because we're currently not even there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does either one of you want to add on?
Different communities that have very incredibly productive, really diverse, very dynamic cities, and that are really embedded. They're called socio-ecological systems that are deeply embedded and engaged with their environments, that are the book. And we have this paradigm shift that needs to occur where we just think of climate change solutions as incredibly passive, and that still within this vein of humans and nature being separate. But we know that there are examples, in the Tufinu people in Benin. There's, they have an aquaculture system that feeds 1 million people, that lifts and increases the biodiversity of the lake system there. This is an area that is as large as Los Angeles, that is incredibly wealthy, very well educated, economically very sustainable, and really incredible food security from this relationship to this multi-diverse replanting system within the forest that is called the Kiha. Relationships of how to develop community and culture and density and economics with environment through symbiosis. And I think that's the really big key point. It's not about superiority, or it's not about controlled environments and controlling nature. It's about symbiotic relationships as well. There are communities who live with water for a very long time. We need to learn from those ways.
Yeah. There's another question coming in from Marloes for Bram and Julia. Message and ideas, and what are your strategies? Bram, you spoke of levers. Can you elaborate on that? So Bram, maybe you can answer the question first. So who do you target? So Julia, then maybe you can answer that question first. Who do you target?
Primarily initially my profession, because I've worked in the field of design and I've worked internationally, and I see that designers go to different countries and they really do espouse this idea that the technologies that they bring, that they're the best, and these technologies really go into erasing culture and environmental systems and climate mitigation that is really incredibly destructive. And I think that primarily that's to really talk about the fact that there are already technologies all over the world. The Dutch polderdijk system, we see systems like that in Indonesia that's indigenous. We see systems like that in China that's indigenous. Often they're devalued and thought of as, heritage or agriculture. And thinking of, as a designer, this idea that we have a superiority over other local technologies, that's incredibly false, and that needs to be dispelled.
Yeah. So Bram, I'm not sure if you got the question, but I asked you and Julia, who do you target with your messaging? No, not fully.
Yeah,
then I'm going to go to you. Yeah, the internet connection is a little bit off, but yeah. So the question is, who do you target with your ideas?
Yeah, I hope it's a little bit stable now. But so we target the conservation community writ large, also because we feel that conservation connected, but it's also a community with an incredible sort of cognitive dissonance, right? Where they try time and again to come up with new solutions within the contemporary system that don't then seem to work. And then we're intensifying the biodiversity and extinction crisis. And then they continue to say, well, we need something different, and come with a new magic bullet. Criticize that in order to see if we can, get more and more conservationists, ecologists, biologists, but also, more from the social sciences and more broadly, indigenous communities. A lot of people can call themselves conservationists, to come together and actually think about a whole Earth revision, think about a whole Earth strategy. But in a way that doesn't commodify nature or spectacularize it, but makes it part of the everyday.
Yeah, and I was just thinking it would be a shame that this hour passes and we don't name a elephant in the room. That I was in Mexico with indigenous communities by Ventosa. So if we're talking about sustainable technology and things that are birthed from still an extractive extractive industry and an extractive way of doing, an extractive way of being, we see that a lot of wind parks have been installed there on indigenous land, where the energy is serving big corporations and not the community, but also soil for farmers and making inroads, and a lot of ways where indigenous rights are being actually hurt. So I want to say that it's been an honor for me to visit them and hear from them directly and learn from them directly. So really seeing that the task ahead is really not thinking of technology in a box, connected from the stream of nature, and it's really about technology that is part and parcel of nature as a master inventor that we can align with and learn with. And when we tap into that power, there's an immense restorative ability, but we have to
similar things in Brazil, in Altamira, in the Xingu River, where they planted this whole big hydroelectric dam on indigenous lands and forced so many people out of there. It's terrible what is happening, and also I wanted to actually end on somewhat of a positive note, asking you what ways there are for but we're running out of time, so if you can just sum it up very short, then we can still give that to the audience. Chihiro.
Oh, I have to go first.
Yeah. So what role is there for activism and art and design within this much needed change?
First thing that I really think is that we need to stop thinking of technology as a crop that you just harvest and then it will do its job for you. We need, like as activists, we engage in a collaborative way, both in collective decision making and collective communities and people in general. So that's generic, but I hope it inspires for you to not be stuck by yourself, but be collaborative with somebody else and take the next step where your skill meets the challenge.
Yeah, thank you. And Julia?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually quite a similar approach as well for designers, is to understand that your role as a community engager and are embedded in culture when you're working with different landscapes and in different locations across the globe, that is going to be a huge shift in the way we think about design and the way we think about service and the way we also think about and approach designing for climate change.
Yeah. No, we have to end this talk. I would like to thank you all. Yeah, I know. I just got like a message saying time's up, moving on. So I would like to thank everybody for tuning in. I would like to extend great gratitude to you all, to Bram, especially you now, and Chihiro and Julia Watson. Thank you so much for joining me today in this lovely.
Thank you.